41 days after Rhea spoke into the open sky, every Sibren in the galaxy stopped at the same instant and turned to face the same direction. There are perhaps 400 billion Sibren. They are a swarm-minded species, the Accord's auditors, the ones who feel the temperature of a room before anyone in it has spoken. They are scattered across 10,000 worlds and 500,000 ships, separated by distances that light needs centuries to cross, and they have no faster-than-light communication, because nothing does, because the universe does not permit it. At 1900 hours, Galactic Standard, on the 41st day, all of them stopped. Not most. Not the ones in a single system. All of them, everywhere, in the same instant, across 1100 light-years, which is not possible, which cannot be coordinated, which violates the one law of physics that has never bent for anyone. Every Sibren on every world put down what it was holding, and turned, and faced a point in the sky above the galactic plane where there is nothing at all. No star. No world. No signal. An empty place. They stood that way for 6 seconds. Then they went back to work. 6 seconds does not sound like very much until you understand what it costs. A Sibren auditor aboard a Kedma repair barge near the old Tessely crossing lane was, at that exact moment, walking a docking pilot through the final approach of a hull section under tow. For 6 seconds, the auditor did not speak. The pilot, who had never once in 3 years of runs needed to correct for the swarm's silence, did not react quickly enough, and the section drifted 4 meters off its line before the auditor came back to itself and finished the call in the same flat unhurried tone it had used before it stopped, as if 6 seconds had not passed at all. The section missed the barge's forward strut by a margin the pilot would later describe, in a report nobody read for weeks, as closer than I would like to discuss. That was the smallest cost of the 6 seconds. There were others. A Sibren monitoring a reactor threshold on an aging Orisk transport went still in the middle of a routine variance call, and the transport's own automated systems caught the drift half a second before a human engineer would have needed to. Nobody died. That was, several Velthani analysts noted afterward with the particular bloodless horror of people whose entire profession is measuring near misses, the only reason anyone found out how close they had come. When the Accord's remaining authorities asked them what had happened, the Sibren could not answer, because the Sibren do not think in words, and the mood that had passed through the swarm had no equivalent in any language the galaxy possessed. The closest any auditor could render it took 3 days to translate, and when it came through, the Velthani linguist who finished the work sat down on the floor of her office and did not get up for a long time. The Sibren said, "Something looked at us." 400 light-years away, in a small stolen ship, Nima Salrith read that report and understood, with the total clarity of a mind built to see the shape of things, that she had been decoding the wrong question for 400 years. The question was never why humanity does not break. The question was why 100,000 years ago somebody built an entire civilization whose only real purpose was to make sure nobody in this galaxy ever got loud. They stopped. I want to tell you how, because the how is the only part that matters, and because it did not happen the way anyone expected, least of all Rhea. She had broadcast Elon's sorrow into every human channel and then sat down with her hands in her lap, and for 4 hours nothing happened at all. That was the worst part. Not rage. Silence. 11 billion people and the largest fleet ever assembled, and the whole thing simply hung there over the open throat of the Accord's core worlds, thinking. And then it did not come apart the way a fleet comes apart. It came apart the way a person does. It started with a gunner on a corvette called the Ridgeline, a 26-year-old from a farming world nobody has heard of, who had lost his mother and both his sisters at Anvil. When the fire order came down the chain, he did not refuse it. He did not make a speech. He simply did not move his hands. His section chief looked at him and then looked at her own hands and also did not move them, and the two of them sat there in a gun blister above a defenseless world and said nothing to each other at all. It happened 400,000 times in 90 minutes. On a transport called the Aurelia Vance, on the far side of the fleet, a loader named Casimir O'Yelleran stood in a narrow magazine corridor with a crate of ordnance at his feet, the same crate he had lifted 100 times that week, and found that his hands would not do it again. He had grown up 2 systems from Anvil. He had never fired a weapon before the war found him, and he had spent the minutes before Rhea spoke praying, in the half-forgotten way his grandmother had taught him, for a woman he had never met to say something that would let him go home still recognizing himself. He did not know, standing there with the crate at his feet, that she already had. He only knew that his crew chief was standing exactly as still, 4 feet away, looking at her own hands as if they belonged to someone she used to know, and that neither of them said anything, and that the silence between them was the quietest sound Casimir O'Yelleran ever heard in his life. Fire control logs recovered afterward showed the same pattern across the fleet in numbers that made the story impossible to argue with, if anyone had still wanted to argue. Strike solutions built. Loaded. Never released. Batteries charged and crews at station and readiness boards glowing an obedient, meaningless green, because readiness and willingness had never once, in 100,000 years of Accord doctrine, needed to be different words, and nobody had built a system to measure the gap between them. Aldous Vane's own flag officers watched the numbers hold at 0 and did not understand, at first, that they were not looking at a malfunction. They were looking at 400,000 malfunctions that agreed with each other perfectly. Nobody organized it. There was no mutiny, no faction, no leader, no moment where a hero stood up and turned the tide. There was just an enormous number of ordinary people, each one alone, each one having heard a dead man explain what their species had done the last time it stood in this exact place, deciding privately, in the dark, with nobody watching, that they were not going to be the hands that did it. Some of them wept. Most of them did not. A great many of them still wanted to fire, wanted it with their whole bodies, and did not, which is a different and much harder thing and is the entire reason there is still a galaxy. Aldous Vane gave the order 3 times. Rhea Maddox watched him do it, and she has said since that she has never respected anyone more than she respected him in that hour, because he was not a monster and he was not bluffing and he meant it, and when it became clear that the fleet was not going to obey him, he did not scream or threaten or purge. He stood in the middle of his own flagship's bridge with the authority of 11 billion people and no hands to do anything with it, and he understood what had happened to him. Rhea watched him on a feed relayed to every ship still listening, and she thought of Davin Creel a year before, standing alone in a depot office with a piece of burned hull plating on the desk in front of him, arriving at the same discovery from the opposite side of the same war. She had believed, watching Creel's broadcast, that it took an old soldier to recognize the exact moment his own doctrine had run out from under him. She understood now that it was never about doctrine. It was about the instant a person is finally given permission to stop pretending they wanted the thing they had spent their whole life being told to want. And then Aldous Vane, the reasonable man from Tesseley Crossing, the marshal of the Hearth Fleet, the man who had said let us show them, put his face in his hands. And then he said, quietly, to nobody, thank God. Rhea did not include that in any report. She has never told anyone but Nima. She says it is the only truly private thing she has left, and that a man is owed the mercy of not having his worst hour explained by someone else. But she says it is the thing she thinks about most, out of everything, because it taught her the thing that Elon Sorrow, for all his wisdom, never learned. Vane had wanted to be stopped. Almost all of them had. That is what nobody understood, not the Accord, not Sorrow, not Nima Salrith with her 400 years of arithmetic. The Accord had spent 100,000 years believing that nothing stops unless you make it. Sorrow had believed his people could not stop, and had killed a civilization over it. And it turned out that a species which cannot be made to stop can still, in enormous numbers, quietly and privately and at great cost, choose to. They just needed to know what they were. That was all. That was the whole thing. Sorrow took their memory to protect them, and the memory was the only break they had ever had, and for 10,000 years his descendants walked around without it, doing exactly what he was afraid of, because you cannot refuse to become a thing you have never been told you are. Rhea Maddox gave them a mirror. And 400,000 people looked into it and put their hands down. The galaxy survived by 90 minutes and the private decency of strangers. Do not let anyone tell you it was a fleet, or a hero, or a woman from Anvil. It was a gunner on the ridgeline who did not move his hands. Nima Salrith spent the 41 days between the broadcast and the Sibren turning to face an empty sky doing the only thing she had ever been good at. Elon Sarrow's data core had a second passage. She had cracked 2 lines of it. They said, they were not the reason we stopped. And, we stopped because it was watching, and it only notices the ones that get loud. The rest would not come. And this was the thing that ate at her, because Nema Salrith was the finest reckoner of her generation and she had opened a 10,000-year-old human archive in 19 days, and now she had spent over 2 weeks on 11 more lines and had gotten nowhere at all, and the reason was that the cipher was not human. She worked the way she had always worked, which was to distrust cleverness and trust structure. She built a lattice of every known encryption method in the Accord's 2,000-entry catalog and tested Saro's 11 lines against each of them in turn, methodically, the way a locksmith tries every key on a ring before admitting the ring itself is wrong. She slept, when she slept, sitting upright in the pilot's couch of the little Kedmer hauler, because lying down felt to her like a decision she was not yet willing to make. Rhea, who had learned on a wall that a body denied rest simply borrows against a future it does not yet have, brought her food she rarely touched and left it anyway, because it was a thing to do with her hands, and because 400 years of a life spent not needing anyone had left Nema Salrith badly equipped to ask for the one thing she had, quietly, come to need. The galley smelled of the same recycled coffee it had smelled of since the crossing. Nema did not require it, but she had taken to making it regardless, a human ritual adopted without ever deciding to adopt it, because she had noticed that Rhea unclenched, faintly, at the smell of it, and Nema Salrith had become, in her own careful way, a woman who paid attention to what steadied the only friend she had left in the galaxy. Sorrow had not encrypted the main message. He had wanted it found. He left the vigil, the stopping, the whole confession of his species, in plain human speech for anyone who could reach it. And then he had taken one final passage and wrapped it in something that was not Vigil standard, not any human system, not Accord, not Kedmer, not any of the 2,000 catalogued encryption architectures in 100,000 years of galactic record. He had used something he did not build. Which meant he had been given it. That was the fact Nema could not get past, and she turned it over for days the way you worry a loose tooth. 10,000 years ago, a human being standing over the conquered galaxy had come into possession of an encryption system that no civilization in recorded history has ever produced. Somebody handed Elon Sorrow a lock. And he used it exactly once, for exactly one paragraph, which he hid from his own descendants while hiding nothing else. You do not lock a door against people you are already telling everything to. He was hiding it from whoever gave him the lock. Rhea found her in the galley on the 18th day, staring at 11 lines of unbroken cipher, and asked her what was wrong, and Nema said something that Rhea has repeated many times since, because it was the moment the reckoner stopped being an Accord mind and became something else. For 400 years, Nema said, I have solved problems by finding the assumption underneath them. Every species has a yield. Every record is complete. Every encryption belongs to somebody in the catalog. She looked up. I have just realized that my catalog has 100,000 years in it, and my civilization is 100,000 years old, and I have spent my entire life assuming those two numbers are the same number by coincidence. A long pause. Rhea. What if the catalog starts when the Accord starts because the Accord is what started the catalog? What if everything before it was not empty? What if it was cleared? And Rhea Maddox, who was not a reckoner and had never solved anything more complicated than a shipping manifest, said the thing that broke it open, because she had spent 19 days on a wall learning that the enemy's most reliable behavior is the thing they never think to hide. She said, then stop trying to break his lock. Go find the other one. Nema sat very still for the length of time it took her to run the thought to its end, which for a reckoner of her caliber was perhaps 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds 400 years of trained certainty rearranged itself around a quartermaster's offhand sentence. Nema Salrith understood that she had just been out-reckoned, in her own specialty, by a woman who had never run a calculation harder than a shipping manifest, and that this was now the 3rd time it had happened, and that she had stopped being surprised by it, and had started, instead, to rely on it. Nema stared at her. He didn't invent it, Rhea said. You just told me that. Somebody gave it to him. So somebody else has used it. Nema, you're the best archivist alive in a civilization that never throws anything away. Stop hunting a human cipher in human records. She leaned forward. Go look in yours. It took Nema Salrith 19 days and the help of the last 3 people in the galaxy she should have been able to trust, and what she found at the bottom of her own civilization's oldest archive ended the Accord more completely than the entire Hearth fleet ever could have. She could not go herself. She was still under sentence, still hunted by an order that had not yet noticed it no longer had the authority to hunt anyone. So the search was done by an unlikely committee, VICO, whose hidden Kedmer channels ran through every yard and dock and archive annex in the Accord because somebody has to weld the shelving. Belle Astra, the foreman who had put down her tools in front of the last measure and had since become something the Accord had no word for, a working person the powerful were now afraid of, and Oral Vandermeer. Vandermeer. 600 years old. The man who fired the last measure. The man who had killed 60,000 people on Anvil to keep his civilization from finding out it had been spared. He came to them 9 days after the broadcast. He did not ask forgiveness, which is the only reason Rhea did not kill him, and she thought about it, and she has never pretended otherwise. He simply arrived, alone, unarmed, in the empty quarter, and stood in the galley of a stolen Kedmer hauler in front of a human whose world he had erased, and said, "I have the keys to every sealed archive in the Accord. I have had them for 600 years. I am the last custodian who can open the founding record. I am here because you were right and I was wrong and there is nothing I can do about the dead." He paused. "Use me. I am not asking to be anything else." Rhea did not answer him for a long moment. She has said, since, that she spent that silence doing the arithmetic she had promised herself she would never do again, weighing a man's usefulness against his debt, the exact calculation the Accord had built a religion out of, the exact calculation she had accused Nima of making about her own species. She hated that she was capable of it. She did it anyway, because Anvil was gone twice now and she was done pretending grief and strategy lived in different rooms of her. What she decided, in the end, was not forgiveness. It was smaller than that, and colder, and more useful. She decided that a man could be a war criminal and also be the only person alive who could open a door, and that both of those facts could be true at once without her having to resolve which one mattered more. And that is how the deepest secret in the galaxy came to be opened by a welder, a foreman, a war criminal, and a disgraced reckoner reading over their shoulders from 400 light-years away, which is, Nima has said, the most honest committee the Accord ever assembled. It was not clean work, and it should not be remembered as clean. Belle Astra spent 3 of the 8 days disguised as a hull inspector, walking corridors beneath the great pale Senate chamber with a Kedmer work permit that Vico had forged from a genuine one 3 decades expired, her hands steady on a scanner she did not fully know how to read, relaying everything she saw back through a relay chain of welders who had never met each other and would never be told each other's names. Twice she was stopped. Twice she talked her way past a board security officer by complaining, with real and unfeigned exhaustion, about the state of the ventilation shafts, because there is no lie in the galaxy more convincing than a tired tradesperson complaining about someone else's infrastructure. Vico never left the little hauler, and did the harder thing, which was to sit in the dark for 8 days sending other people into danger she could not share, one relay at a time, living with not knowing, hour to hour, whether the last message she sent had reached a friend or a trap. Vandermeer's contribution took 7 minutes and cost him more than either of the others' 8 days. He walked, alone and unescorted, into the archive wing he had commanded for 600 years, greeted the 2 junior custodians on duty by name, asked after a colleague's convalescing father, and requested access to a cross-reference he was, technically, still authorized to pull, because no one had yet had the presence of mind to revoke the authority of a man who had just committed the single greatest act of violence in 10,000 years. He signed his own name to the request. He did not disguise anything. When Nima asked him afterward why he had not simply forged the access the way Belle Astra had, he said, "Because I am done hiding what I am, Reckoner. I did that for 600 years. I would like the last entries under my name to be true ones, even this one." The founding record of the Accord sits beneath the great pale Senate chamber on the Velthani homeworld, in a vault that predates every law and every species currently sitting in that chamber. 5 custodians in 10,000 years have opened it. Vandermeer was one of them. He had read it once, 600 years ago, on the day he took his office, and he had never spoken of it, and when Nima asked him what was in it he told her the truth, which was that he did not know. Because the founding record is not written in any language the Accord can read. It is written in Elon Sero's cipher. Nima Saurith sat in a cold galley in the grave of an ancient war and looked at the charter of her own civilization, the oldest document her people possess, the thing the entire Accord was built on, 100,000 years old, 90,000 years older than Elon Saro, and it was locked with the same key a human being had used 10,000 years ago to hide one paragraph from something. Two civilizations. 90,000 years apart. Neither of which ever met the other before the war. Both handed the same lock by the same hand. It has been here the entire time, Nima said. Whatever it is. It was here before us. It talked to my founders. It talked to sorrow. It has been talking to whoever gets big enough to hear it, for 100,000 years, and every single one of us who heard it did the same thing afterward. She looked up at Rhea, and Rhea says her voice was perfectly steady, which was somehow worse. My founders built the accord immediately after. Sorrow burned the vigil immediately after. Rhea, those are the same act. Those are two civilizations receiving the same message and doing the same thing. Which is what? Getting quiet, said Nima Salrath. And making sure everyone else does too. Nobody was in charge, and the galaxy kept turning anyway, and that fact alone would have been unthinkable to every Velthani who had ever lived. Fleet Marshal Davin Creel, the man who had refused to fight and could not entirely explain why anyone still listened to him, spent those same weeks doing the only thing that seemed to matter, which was making sure the light stayed on. He did not call himself a government. He was careful, in every broadcast, to say so. He requisitioned nothing he was not asked to requisition. He settled disputes by the dozen between systems that had spent 100,000 years being told what to do by a Senate that no longer answered its own relays, and he did it the way an Orisk does everything, which was by treating the absence of orders as the worst kind of battlefield, the kind with no clear front. The Kedmer did not wait to be told what came next. Across the yards where the custodian transports had once been serviced in silence, Balastra's 41 welders became 400, then 4,000, an informal register of people who had put down their tools once and found they did not want to pick them back up in the old way. They kept building. They kept repairing. But they began, for the first time in the memory of any living Kedmer, to ask what a ship was for before they signed off on it, and more than one hull left the yards that season with a question stenciled inside an access panel where no inspector would ever think to look, in the private hand of the person who welded it shut. The Sibren said nothing publicly at all, because the Sibren had stopped filing tally reports the day the last measure fired, and no one had yet found a reason to ask them to resume. But the swarm's private mood, the one Velthani linguist spent careers failing to fully render, had shifted again in those weeks, in a way that unsettled the handful of scholars still paying attention. It was no longer shame. It was something closer to attention, the particular quality of a room that has stopped talking because it has just heard, faintly, through a wall, the beginning of a sentence it has been waiting its whole life to hear the end of. Nobody connected the two things yet. Nobody would, for a little while longer. But it is worth telling you now, because it is true, and because a story like this one has always let you know things a beat before the people living it do. While Creel kept the lights on and the Kedmer asked their quiet questions, the swarm had already started to lean. Rhea Maddox saw her daughter for the first time in 121 days on a grey world called Bell Hollow, in a house belonging to a woman named Priya who had taken in 9 Anvil children and asked nothing from anyone. Bell Hollow was not much of a world. It was a grey, wet, unglamorous agricultural colony that nobody had ever put on a recruitment poster, which was precisely why Oduya had chosen it for the manifest months before, back when he was quietly moving dependents off worlds he could not yet explain moving them from. Priya had not been on any list of approved guardians. She had simply been standing at the evacuation point when the transport came through, had recognized 4 of the children from her own street on Anvil, had recognized a 5th as belonging to a family she had never much liked and taken her anyway, and by the time anyone with the authority to object had noticed what she had done, there were 9 of them living in a house built for 3, sleeping 2 to a bed, and Priya was teaching all 9 the multiplication tables in the evenings, because she had decided, without asking anyone's permission, that a childhood interrupted by a war did not also have to be a childhood interrupted by arithmetic. The other 8 children came to the door when they heard the walkway, because every one of them had learned, since Anvil, to notice an unfamiliar footstep the way Nell had learned to check a room. They did not come outside. They watched from the window, 8 faces at different heights, the way a colony watches its own history walk up a front path, and none of them said a word, because each of them understood, in a private way no adult had explained to them, exactly whose mother this was, and what she had cost them, and what she had maybe saved them from, and none of them had worked out yet which of those was heavier. I want to slow down here, because this is the last quiet thing in this story, and because everything that follows is very large, and you should have this first. Nell Maddox was 9 years old. She had been evacuated off Anvil 6 days before the world folded, on a transport, with a bag she had packed herself. She had lost her home, her street, her school, every person she had ever known who was not on that transport, and the concept of a place to go back to. She had spent 11 days believing her mother was dead, which is exactly as long as her mother had spent believing the same about her, and neither of them found that out until much later, and when they did it did not help. Rhea came up the front walk of Priya's house and Nell was sitting on the step. She did not run. That is the part Rhea tells. Nell did not run to her, and Rhea understood why instantly, and it went through her like a blade, because a child who runs is a child who believes the world gives things back. Nell stood up. She looked at her mother for a long moment, carefully, all the way you check a manifest. And then she said, in a small flat voice that Rhea will hear until the day she dies, "You said you weren't going anywhere." There is no answer to that. Rhea did not try to make one. She sat down on the step, because her legs had stopped working, and after a while Nell sat down next to her, not touching, and the two of them looked at a gray street on a world neither of them had chosen. "I know," Rhea said. "I lied. I'm not going to do it again." "You're going to leave again?" "Yes." Nell nodded slowly, absorbing this the way she absorbed everything now, without protest, because she had learned in the dark under the cargo terminals that asking does not control the world. And then she said the thing that broke her mother completely. She said, "Is it because of the thing you did? The broadcast?" She was looking at her hands. "Priya says you saved everybody. The other kids say you're why Anvil's gone." And Rhea Maddox, the wall of Anvil, the conscience of a species, sat on a step on a grey world and understood that both of those things were true, and that her 9-year-old daughter had already worked that out by herself, and that there was no version of this where the child got to have a simple mother. So she told her the truth. All of it. Everything. Sitting on a step, for 2 hours, in language a 9-year-old could hold, because Rhea Maddox had built her entire life around one belief and she was not going to abandon it now for the one person it cost the most. You do not get to decide for other people what they can carry. When she was done, Nell was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "So the man 10,000 years ago. He didn't tell anybody. And that's why it happened again." "Yes. And you told everybody. So it won't." "I hope so. I don't know." Nell thought about that. And then she leaned against her mother's arm, the first time she had touched her, and she said, "I'd rather know. Even the bad stuff." A pause. "I hated not knowing if you were alive. That was worse than if somebody just told me you were dead." Rhea Maddox put her arms around her daughter on a front step on a grey world, and cried for the first time since Anvil folded, and understood that a 9-year-old had just independently derived, from nothing but her own 11 days in the dark, the entire moral thesis of the last 10,000 years of galactic history. 2 days later, the report came in about the Sibren. And Rhea kissed her daughter goodbye and went back out, and this time she did not lie about it. Vandermeer could not read the founding record. Nobody could. But Nima Salrith did not need to read it, because she was a reckoner, and a reckoner does not need the text when she has the behavior. Here is what she did, and it is the finest piece of work in her 400 years. She stopped trying to decode the charter. Instead she took the accord itself, 100,000 years of law, doctrine, ritual, and habit, the most thoroughly documented civilization in galactic history, and she reckoned it backward. Not what does it do? What is it for? What would you build, if you had one purpose, and you had to hide that purpose from your own descendants for 100,000 years, and it still had to work after they forgot? And when she had the answer, she checked it against every fact she had ever learned, and it fit all of them, and it was the most horrifying thing she had ever computed. Consider the accord. Consider it honestly, for the first time. It has a law, the yield, which states that every species breaks, and which is enforced not as a theory but as a religion. It has a priesthood of calculators whose entire function is to determine the exact minimum force required to make anyone stop. It considers waste the only true sin, and defines waste as any force beyond the minimum needed to make a thing fold. It corrects any species that steps out of the order. It does not conquer, it absorbs. It does not annihilate, it quiets. It has spent 100,000 years taking every emerging civilization in 4/5 of the galaxy and folding it, gently and reasonably and irresistibly, into a managed, measured, orderly whole that never grows too fast, never expands too far, never fights too loudly, and never, ever gets big enough to be seen. The Accord is not a government. It is not an empire. It is not a garden. It is a lid. She tested the idea against every fact she had. The Halrun, the maritime species she had reckoned in 4 days at the start of her career, had sworn they would never bow, and Nima had always read that as bravado, data to be plotted against a curve. Reread through the lid, the Halrun's oaths were not bravado at all. They were noise, and the Accord's oldest professional wisdom. The louder a species swears it will not yield, the more precisely you can predict the hour that it will, was never a discovery about psychology. It was a design specification. A species that shouted was a species drawing attention downward, and the Accord's deepest instinct, the one it called civilization, was to find that species and quiet it as fast as the math allowed. The tally itself, the sacred running number every warship carried, was not the mercy generations of reckoners had told themselves it was. It was a metronome. It existed to tell an entire crew, in the cadence of a bureaucratic ritual, exactly how much longer the noise would have to continue, because a species that always knew when the noise would stop never had to ask why the quiet mattered in the first place. And waste, the great administrative sin of Accord law, the thing a marshal could be censured for more surely than for cruelty, reread the same way. Waste was never truly about lives or resources. Waste was any force applied for longer than necessary to achieve silence, any war that ran one day past the day it could have ended. The Accord had spent 100,000 years punishing inefficiency as if it were the highest crime in the universe, and it was, just not for the reason anyone had ever written down. Every law Nima had spent 4 centuries enforcing without question turned, one at a time, like tumblers in the same enormous lock, and by the time she reached the last of them she was no longer surprised. She was simply, finally, reading her own civilization for the first time in her life. It was built, 100,000 years ago, by founders who had heard something, to hold the entire galaxy quiet. Every law in it is a noise suppression protocol. The yield is not a discovery about biology, it is a policy. Make sure everything yields. Make sure nothing ever gets loud. And the founders, who understood that no civilization keeps a secret for 100 millennia, did the only thing that works, they did not tell their descendants why. They built the reflex and buried the reason. They made an entire species pathologically devoted to quieting the galaxy and let them think it was because they were civilized. She thought, absurdly, of the comfortable moon where they had once tried to cage her with kindness, and of the young attendant who had called her a hero and never mentioned Anvil at all. She understood now that the moon had not been an aberration. It had been the whole method, in miniature, a soft room, a gentle silence, a kind erasure, offered to exactly one reckoner who had gotten too close to hearing the actual shape of the family business. She had escaped the small version of the lid. She was looking, now, directly at the large one. Nima Salrith understood, finally, why the Accord had been unable to survive the existence of humanity, and it had nothing to do with pride. A species that cannot be made to yield is a species that cannot be quieted. Humanity was not a military problem to the Accord. Humanity was a hole in the lid. Every doctrine the Accord had, every tool, every 100,000-year-old reflex, existed to make things stop being loud, and it met the one species in the galaxy on which none of it worked. That is why they erased the first contact. That is why they built a doomsday out of pure terror and hid it in a grave. Not because humanity might beat them. Because humanity might be heard. They were not the reason we stopped, Nima said, into the silence of a cold galley, quoting a dead man. Sorrow meant the Accord. Everyone has always read that line as him saying the Accord was not the reason. It is. But that is not what it means. She looked up. It is not a denial. It is a warning. He is saying, do not think the enemy you can see is the thing that matters. And Rhea Maddox, who had broadcast Elon Sero's voice on every frequency in the galaxy, into the open sky, as loudly as any human being has spoken in 10,000 years, sat very still. "Nima," she said. "How loud is loud?" Nima Salrith did not answer, because 41 days after the broadcast, 400 billion Sibren across 1100 light-years had stopped at the same instant and turned to face an empty place in the sky. They pointed everything they had at it. That was the last coordinated act the Accord ever performed, and it was not performed by the Senate, which had stopped being able to make anyone do anything, but by Fleet Marshal Davin Creel, who was by then the closest thing the old empire had to a functioning authority for the simple reason that he was the only senior officer left whom everybody trusted, and the reason everybody trusted him was that he was the one who had refused. Creel turned every instrument in the Accord toward the point in the sky the Sibren had faced. There is nothing there. That is the first thing, and it is important. It is not a dark region. It is not a nebula or a void or a shrouded system. It is a perfectly ordinary piece of empty sky above the galactic plane, 90 degrees off the disk, out where there are no stars because there is nothing out there to make stars from. Every telescope in the Accord looked at it for 19 days and found precisely what 100,000 years of astronomy said they would find, which was nothing at all. And then a Kedmer shipwright, not an astronomer, a welder, working a hull scan on a drydock 40 light-years away, noticed the thing that 400 billion credits of Accord instrumentation had missed, because she was not looking for an object. She was looking for a flaw. The seam is wrong there. Underneath that empty piece of sky, in the layer beneath spacetime where every ship in the galaxy travels, the substrate is not flat. It is under tension. Something very large is resting on the other side of it, and has been resting there for a very long time, and the only reason no one had ever noticed is that no one had ever had a reason to run a whole flaw scan on the fabric of the universe in a direction no ship has ever needed to go. It is not in the galaxy. It is underneath it. And it is not moving. Her name was Isbit Sorar, and she had been running whole flaw diagnostics for 9 years, long enough to know every false positive her equipment could produce, and this was not one of them. She almost did not report it. Hull scans of empty sky were not glamorous work, and a junior tech who cried wolf over a sensor ghost did not get promoted. She ran the scan 4 times before she called her supervisor, and her supervisor ran it twice more before he called Creel directly, skipping 6 layers of a chain of command that had, by then, largely stopped answering anyway. Isbit Sorar's name appears exactly once in the Accord surviving records, in a maintenance log, misspelled, and she will likely never know that she is the reason the galaxy learned, at last, what it had been standing on top of for 100,000 years. Creel did not understand what he was looking at, and he was honest about that in every report he filed, which was itself a small revolution, an Accord Marshal admitting ignorance in an official channel, the kind of admission the old Senate would have quietly filed as a resignation. He pulled every telescope, every hull scanner, every sensor platform still answering to anyone, and pointed all of them at the same patch of ordinary sky for 19 days, and when the picture came back the same 19 times, he did the only thing his 40 years of service had ever taught him to do with a number he could not explain. He passed it to the one person in the galaxy whose entire profession was making sense of numbers nobody wanted to be true. Nima Salrith ran the reckoning, and the numbers came back, and for the first time in 400 years she did not write them down, because she did not want them to exist. The tension in the seam has been increasing. Slowly. Measurably. Not since the broadcast, that was the thing she had feared, and it would almost have been a mercy, because a thing you caused is a thing you might undo. The tension has been increasing for 11,000 years. It started rising about 1,000 years before Elon Sarro burned the vigil. He did not stop because it was watching. He stopped because it had started to turn over. So here is where we are, and I want to lay it out plainly, because the shape of it is the whole thing. 100,000 years ago, somebody heard something. We do not know who they were. They are not in any record, because they are the ones who made the records, and the first thing they did was clear everything that came before. What we know is what they built afterward, a civilization spanning 4/5 of the galaxy, with a sacred law that everything yields, a priesthood to enforce it, and a 100,000-year mission to fold every emerging species into a quiet, orderly, measured whole. They called it the Accord. They told their children it was peace. It was a lid, and they buried the reason for it so deep that 100 millennia later the finest reckoner of her generation had to reconstruct it backward from her own civilization's reflexes, like a doctor diagnosing a patient from a limp. 10,000 years ago, a human being named E05 stood over the conquered galaxy with the power to take all of it, and heard the same thing the founders heard, and put down the knife, and burned his own civilization to the ground. He told his people it was because of what they were becoming. That was true. It was not the reason. He made humanity small and mute and forgetful and left the Accord alive to be a lid over his own children, and for 10,000 years it worked, and his descendants grew back up from nothing thinking they were new, thinking they were the underdogs, thinking the Accord was the biggest thing in the sky. And 60 days ago, a quartermaster from a rock called Anvil put a dead man's voice on every frequency in the galaxy and told 11 billion people the truth, because she had decided she would rather be wrong out loud than right in secret. She was right. Understand that. Everything Rhea Maddox did was right. The galaxy is still here because 400,000 people heard that broadcast and put their hands down, and there is no version of this where staying quiet and ignorant would have ended better, because staying quiet and ignorant is precisely what walked humanity into the same room twice. She was right, and she was loud, and both of those things are now true forever. I want to say one more thing about that, because it is easy, watching from this distance, to make Rhea Maddox sound certain, and she was not for one single hour of it. She has told everyone who asks, because she has stopped protecting herself from the question, that she still does not know if she was right. She knows the galaxy is still here. She does not know whether that is the same thing as having been correct, and she has made her peace with never being able to tell the difference, because the alternative was to become one more good person deciding, quietly, on everyone else's behalf, and she had already watched what that decision cost, more than once, from people wiser than her. 41 days later, 400 billion Sibren turned to face an empty place in the sky. And underneath that empty place, on the other side of the fabric that every ship in this galaxy travels through, something very large has been resting for longer than there has been a galactic record to record it in, and for 11,000 years it has been slowly, patiently turning over, the way a sleeper turns over long before they wake. Nima Salrith cannot decode the last 11 lines of Elon Saro's warning. She has the cipher of the Accord's founding charter now, the same lock, the same hand, 90,000 years apart, and it does not help, because both documents are locked and the key was never given to anyone. Whoever handed that lock to the founders, and handed it again to a human being 10,000 years ago, did not give away the key. They gave away a way to keep a secret. And the only thing you can conclude from that, the thing Nima says out loud now, in the flat voice of a reckoner reading a number she does not want, is that the thing under the seam did not warn two civilizations out of kindness. It taught them to be quiet. It taught the Accord to hold the whole galaxy down for 100,000 years. It taught Elon Saro to kill his own empire and take his species' memory away. It has been teaching, patiently, for as long as anyone has been alive to be taught, and every civilization that received the lesson did the same thing, immediately, without hesitation, and never told anyone why. There is only one question left, and it is the one Rhea Maddox asked on a front step on a grey world, with her daughter leaning against her arm, and it is the question this whole story has been walking toward since a clerk wrote the word incomplete in a box. Why would the thing that hunts the loud go to so much trouble to teach us how to hide? There is an answer. Nell Maddox, 9 years old, gave it in 11 words, sitting on that step, and neither her mother nor the finest mind in the Accord has been able to find a flaw in it, and it is the reason nobody in this story has slept since. She said, maybe it's not hiding us from itself. It's hiding with us.